Welcome to the ICMP DNA Laboratory. The ICMP DNA Laboratory provides the capability for the ICMP to offer large-scale DNA-led human identification services in support of the identification of missing persons. The ICMP is the only international organization exclusively tasked with accounting for missing persons. The DNA Laboratory supports the work to identify those who are missing as a result of conflict, such as in Iraq, organized crime, mass disasters, irregular migration, and other causes. The ICMP works with governments to establish institutions that will sustain and support long-term effective missing persons identification processes. The ICMP also works closely with civil society organizations and families of the missing. In large-scale contexts where persons have gone missing, DNA testing is often the only reliable means to identify those who are missing. In the ICMP DNA Laboratory, similar techniques are employed that are used in forensic DNA laboratories around the world. However, we compare the DNA profiles that we obtain from unidentified remains to those of family members. This is done on a large scale using separate databases for both unidentified remains and family members. The ICMP DNA Laboratory receives two main types of samples. We receive skeletal remains, such as a bone fragment that looks like this, and family reference samples that are collected using a reference sample collection kit such as this. These reference samples are collected from family members and stored on a card in such a format. Let me take you on a tour around our laboratory and I'll explain how we process these two types of samples. In this laboratory, we start the process of handling post-mortem samples, that is bones or teeth. When we receive samples from the pathologist or from anthropologists working in the field, we must first receive those into our laboratory tracking systems, document the sample as we have received it, and then begin the process of processing that bone sample. This process includes mechanically cleaning the surface of the bone, washing the bone, and then eventually, once it's dried, grinding the bone into powder. Each sample that the ICMP DNA Laboratory receives is coded with a unique barcode. This is one measure to allow us to process all samples anonymously. Each sample that the ICMP DNA Laboratory receives is processed in an identical manner regardless of where it originates from. So in this laboratory, we take the bone powder that we've previously obtained and demineralize that, dissolve that powder so that we obtain a solution that contains DNA. This solution of DNA we then purify to remove any material from cells or from the bones themselves that will affect the quality of the results. In this laboratory, we have both manual and automated methods for extracting the DNA from bone samples. These methods have been developed by the ICMP and used on a large scale to extract DNA from challenging bone or tooth samples over many years. These methods are what makes the ICMP different from other forensic DNA laboratories in that we specialize particularly in extracting DNA from skeletal remains. Once we have obtained a pure DNA extract in the previous laboratory, we must first determine how much DNA is present in each sample. We call this process quantification. Also in this laboratory, we prepare our samples for downstream processing. In this process, we copy or amplify the DNA in our sample. We create millions of copies of the fragments of DNA that we're interested in analyzing. This process works in a similar way to a photocopier. This process is known as PCR. We are now in the ICMP's reference sample processing laboratory. In this laboratory, we process the family reference samples that we collect from family members. It's much easier to obtain the DNA from these reference samples than it is from the post-mortem sample process that we've already shown you. These samples that we receive are usually collected in the format of a card. A punch can be taken from these cards to allow us to amplify the DNA, similar to the process I've already described. Reference samples that we collect from family members are critical to the work of the ICMP DNA laboratory. It's particularly key to collect reference samples from certain family members. For example, parents are a particularly good option. Alternatively, siblings or children and spouses can be good relatives to collect samples from. More distant relatives, such as uncles, aunts, cousins, nieces, and nephews, may be of use, but the chances of successfully identifying the missing person are lower with these more distant relatives. In this laboratory, we complete the last part of our sample processing. Here we visualize the DNA that we've copied in our amplification process. In our standard testing that we perform here at the ICMP, we use a technique known as short tandem repeat testing, or STR testing. This involves looking at approximately 20 regions of the DNA that you have inherited from your mother and your father. We can use this inheritance of DNA from your mother and father to assess the relationships between you and other family members also. This is sometimes insufficient to resolve missing persons cases and to identify those who are missing, particularly where the unidentified remains are particularly degraded samples, or if there are insufficient family reference samples available for analysis. Therefore, the ICMP has been working on developing more advanced techniques using massively parallel or next generation sequencing that look at up to 1,000 or even more regions of your DNA. Following the completion of sample processing, we must then analyze the data that's obtained. This is what the DNA profiles that we obtain look like, where you can see that you have two peaks represented at each region, one from your mother and one from your father. Following DNA profile analysis, we then perform DNA matching on a database level. If a DNA match is obtained, a DNA match report is produced. This report looks like this, demonstrating both the original sample as we documented it when we received it, and also the genetic data that were the results obtained for this sample. The ICMP DNA laboratory does not make identifications formally. Rather, we issue DNA match reports to the country where the sample originated. Thank you for joining us on this tour of the ICMP DNA laboratory.